Hola, ¿cómo están? Aquí de
Hola,
regreso.
bienvenidos de vuelta.
Hello, how are you? We're back again.
Joseph Moragrega aquí.
Joseph Moragrega here and Carlos Ramirez on this side.
Bueno, pues ahora tenemos un invitado muy especial.
Well, now we have a very special guest, Diego Assencio, solutions engineer from Hip Hop. How are you?
Estoy bien, ¿cómo están?
Muy bien, muy bien.
I'm fine. How are you? Good. Well, we're very grateful and very pleased to have you with us.
Todo el mundo sabe que Diego comenzó su carrera como físico, pero descubrió la pasión del desarrollo del software durante sus estudios.
Everybody knows that he was a musician, but fell in love with software during his PhD, and that took him to other roles and different projects in the software industry. And in time, Diego realized that his passion went beyond writing code. He loves expressing all that love for software development at GitHub. And Diego will big us from DevOps to DevSecOps, building secure software together. And I'd like to remind the audience that at any time during the presentation, you can leave your questions in the chat, and we'll be very pleased after the presentation to have Diego answer as many questions as we can in the time available. Diego, are you ready to start? I'm ready. Okay, it's all yours.
Entonces, hola, me llamo Diego Assencio.
Hello, my name is Diego Assencio, and I work at
Assencio es
GitHub.
así, cuenta en GitHub por si quieres encontrarme ahí.
And
Y soy desde Alemania.
this is my account if you want to find me. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity of talking about the emerging trend. Please confirm if you can see my slides.
¿Está todo correcto?
Sí, lo vemos.
Ok, perfecto.
Okay, perfect.
Y para aquellos que no estén familiarizados con
For
GitHub,
those that aren't familiar with GitHub, this is a quick introduction. GitHub is a developer platform for collaborative development with millions of developers, thousands of open code communities, thousands of business companies and partners. And we can mention some figure. There are over 65 million developers in github.com. This number is growing very quickly. These developers work with more than 200 million repositories and belong to thousands of open source communities. Just last year, we received over 2 billion contributions from them. And this is so fast that every time I have to give a presentation, I first have to check if the figures I have are still up to date. And GitHub is where open source code is developed. Over 90% of the world's open source code is developed on GitHub, and I'm sure you can recognize some of them on this slide. And these projects are developed by groups of people that go from individual collaborators to engineers that work in the biggest and most innovative software companies in the world, and some of them also shown here on the slide. All these details are very interesting, but let's talk about the creation of secure software. And before starting this discussion, we first need to understand where the project comes from and who writes the code. Most of the modern code projects depend on open code. In fact, 80–90% of the code in a software project comes from an open source, and the rest, between 10 and 20%, is the code where you collaborate with other people in the project. These figures vary depending on the software project, of course, but this image is very frequent in industry. Most of the code in your application doesn't come from you, but from the open source community. And this is brilliant. You don't have to reinvent the wheel and spend time solving problems that have already been solved. You can focus on your creativity and innovation. But this also means that you've indirectly limited thousands of people to your dependents, and you probably won't have a great visibility as to who you've invited or how secure the code is, or the license change, for example, is consistent with your project. For example, you can't use GPL. Maintaining the security is very important, but your open source dependencies also have dependencies. In the end, you can end up with hundreds or thousands of dependencies in your software. And if one of your dependencies has a vulnerability, it's likely that you will also have a vulnerability. And using the work of thousands of developers means that thousands of strangers have access to your production code. So an error or a malicious tag can affect you very strongly. You could just reject open source dependencies in your project. The problem with the approach is rejecting open source dependencies will make you significantly less innovative. You'll spend time doing work that's already been done. And the main software projects in the world, both commercial and non-commercial, depend to a large extent on open source to continue to be relevant and competitive. So going against that trend is not the way. What we need are new processes, new tools, and also new ways of ensuring software development. The good news here is that GitHub, as the home of the open source community, is in a really good position to help with this. And we've developed several solutions to manage the dependence change in modern software. These solutions help innovate and carry out deployments with trust. And we'll talk about this in a few moments. So far, we've spoken about these open source dependents, but what about the code you write? At the GitHub security team carried out a research project where it discovered that the open source developers dedicate more and more time to fighting vulnerabilities, but they don't improve in preventing vulnerabilities in the open code projects. On the blue line, we have the introduction of new lines of code in the open source projects over time in this study. The red line indicates the number of security vulnerabilities that are introduced, and there's a strong correlation between the two, as is to be expected. The more code you write, the more vulnerabilities you add. Things get weird when we look at the purple line. This shows the number of Git confirmation messages that mention vulnerabilities. The trend is clear, and since mid-2017, we see an increase in the rate of comments that mention vulnerabilities. But it doesn't seem to have an effect on the actual number of vulnerabilities. So how that's possible? What that means is that in spite of the growing awareness about security issues, the software is not becoming more secure. So it's not just a matter of knowledge about security. Developing secure software is very difficult, especially in large projects with millions of lines of code. And it's something we cannot ignore. While some security breaches are the result of human rate or attacks like phishing, and most breaches are the result of hackers that exploit the vulnerabilities in the applications. And these figures don't even include other costly security incidents that may not become breaches. Attacks such as service denials can have devastating effects and usually exploit the vulnerabilities of the applications. The conclusion here is clear, that it's basic to protect the applications we create. However, although I understand that the panorama is fairly somber, not writing code is not an option. We need a solution to this problem. Let's look at the way your software is written, where security comes into the process. Correcting a vulnerability introduced at the beginning of the development lifecycle is cheap, but the cost grows at each stage. And if the vulnerability ends up in the production version of your software and it's exploited through an attack, the repair costs can mean millions of dollars. and damage your reputation seriously. The obvious solution is to rethink the way in which we develop software, making security an integral part of the development process from the beginning. And this that we called shift security left. The idea is to not leave security until the end, making sure your code is secure while you're developing. And how can we shift security left? Once we hire a specialist in security as the code is written. The problem here is that the number of security specialists in the software industry is much less than the number of software developers. And in fact, the number of developers is hundreds of times bigger than the number of security specialists. Expecting these specialists to constantly review your code is something that is simply not scalable. However, it's not a kind of solution we haven't looked at before. And to look at what I mean, let's see how software has traditionally been developed. A developer wants to supply solutions on time and within the budget, and they take the software they produce to a security team. The security team analyzes the software to ensure that what is delivered to the customer is safe and complies with the policies. At the end, the operating specialists deploy that software. They want the application to work reliably. The main problem with this approach to software delivery is that these teams aren't aligned in their goals and often see each other as adversaries instead of partners. Security specialists, for example, can be seen as the troublemakers that love to block the deployment of your software. And this is an optimistic view, since in many organizations, the security size either doesn't exist or is infrequent in the development cycle. Around 65% of companies analyze their code less than 6 times a year. This type of conflict is what takes us to DevSecOps, understanding that software is the property of everyone. And this is what led to the DevOps culture in the beginning. And the automation process is key for DevOps to be successful. And what do we do about security? Well, we adopt the same approach. We integrate people in the culture, and we provide automation, and the result is a new software of greater quality and safer that is delivered more quickly and reliably. And this is the goal of DevSecOps. And so far, I mentioned a lot of big problems, but let's see how we can approach them. I haven't come here to make you feel frustrated, but to see how GitHub can help software developers and also security professionals to solve these problems together. GitHub is aware that in the last decade, there have been many attempts to improve the attitude of organizations towards security, but usually they haven't been very successful. And it's something that deeply concerns us because there's an enormous amount of code that's developed. So we've reflected a lot on this, and we've realized that in order to be successful, the security of the applications should be first focused on the developer, because it's always the developer that corrects a vulnerability in the code, regardless of how they reported about the vulnerabilities. And it's only useful if the developers are motivated to work on correcting them. The problem is not the lack of awareness, but the fact that developers aren't remedying the vulnerabilities that are reported to them. And the key to solve this problem is to give priority to the developers. And the security of the application should also be native. The context change distracts the developers, and therefore we have to take the vulnerability reports close to where the code is being developed. And thirdly, the security of the application should be automated. As I said, the security specialists are few in comparison with the developers, and developers are often under pressure to deliver. So a manual approach to security will not scale up because there's a lack of people and not enough time to carry it out properly. Therefore, we have to automate the security experience for the applications.
Así que vamos a resumir lo que hemos hablado.
So let's summary what we've said so far. To achieve the security of the application, we have to ensure that our dependencies are secure. 2, that our code is secure. 3, that security is an integrated part of the development lifecycle, including how the software is built. And 4, we have to make sure that security isn't left to the end or ignored, but it's required during the development lifecycle. Only a combination of all these things will achieve the results we want. So let's talk about concrete solutions, starting with dependencies. To secure your dependencies, first you have to know what those dependencies are. And for this, we have the GitHub graph, the dependency graph. The dependency graph automatically recognizes the dependencies in the repositories, looking at the content of your files, manifest, and lock.
Lo que está haciendo ahora es un repositorio en github.com.
This is a github.com repository. This repository contains the code of a demo project. This application is described in JavaScript. Here we see it. You can see the files, for example, package.json, package.log.json, and if you go to Insights and Dependency Graph, you'll be able to see the dependencies in this repository, including the alerts. There's a bit of Ruby indicating the existence of a gem file. And here we can see the JavaScript dependencies. For example, down here, GIS has its own dependencies.
Ok, no sé qué se ocurre, pero es posible ver aquí también las dependencias
And it's
transitivas.
possible to see I don't know what's happening now.
Ok, tal vez es posible que sea un problema con el navegador. Pues bien.
Must be a problem with the browser. But in the slide, we can see these examples I used. It's also possible to browse and look at the transitive dependencies in each depository. Apart from knowing the dependencies, you need to know whether they're secure or not. And we can use security research data and the National Security Database. All this data is made available to the public in the GitHub Advisory Database here. All that information is free access. Since most open source projects are carried out on GitHub, they're naturally communicated there, and that puts us in a special position since we can quickly react before new vulnerabilities and report the GitHub developers if they're affected by this vulnerability through one of their dependencies. This is what the Dependabot alerts do. They notify if there are known vulnerabilities in your dependencies. For example, here we have, in this repository, there's a banner at the top that shows that some dependencies have known vulnerabilities. And you can also see them by going to security here and then to depend upon alerts. And the vulnerabilities are classified by levels of severity. On the right, if you go to Noko Giri, you can see a detailed description of the problem and a possible way of solving it here, and relevant references down here. There's a lot of information to understand what the problem is, if you like. In spite of knowing that some dependencies have known vulnerabilities, the manual update of these dependencies is a slow process. So Dependabot does that for you. It opens a request for manifest or log files to check the vulnerability and take it to a more recent version where this vulnerability has been corrected. For example, here we have an example of this kind of request that updates the Pug Code Gen package to a new version to solve a vulnerability in version 2.0.2. So fixing a vulnerability is easily as clicking a button here, merge pull request. A pull request open will automatically unleash the work project because you'll know if the change in dependency affects the performance of your application. And here we have a list of commits that show the exact commits between the version you have and the new version, and also shows a compatibility score. The compatibility score is calculated as the percentage of successful executions of CI/CD workflows for the public repositories with the modification recommended by Dependable. And it gives us an idea of the risk related to this change in the code. Dependabot can go a step further and can update your dependencies every time a new version is published. By doing this, it will automatically pick up the latest security corrections in the dependencies, and you can do it at your own rate. You can define the frequency with which Dependabots look for new dependency versions and automatically open a pull request to carry them out. For example, this is an example of the configuration, and it's possible to automatically collect the latest corrections daily or weekly.
Ok, bien. A ser capaz de ver y
Being able to see and easily tackle the vulnerability of the dependencies leads to the natural question: how can you avoid adding dependencies with known vulnerabilities in your software project? First of all, we want to shift left in security, and we can provide a general view of the changes made to manifest and log, so that the developer will easily see what dependencies are being added or removed in the pull request. And what you're seeing here is a set of changes in a log file proposed in a pull request. It's hard to read and interpret for a human, but if we choose rich view here, we can see the changes that are being made in a way that's easy to understand. Added dependencies in green, modified dependencies in yellow, and eliminated dependencies in red. You can also see there are no vulnerabilities in this example, but here we can see that in the pull request and in the review, you can also see the vulnerabilities in the dependencies that are added or modified. For example, like all the technologies I've just mentioned, and although their capacity is impressive, the final goal is to get rid of vulnerabilities. So let's ask the difficult question: do these technologies work in practice? Many developers use them to make their code more secure. The answer in our studies in GitHub are motivating as such. When an organization realizes that that they have a vulnerable dependency in a repository, the average time to remedy the problem is more than 50 days. In other words, 6 months. In GitHubs, we've analyzed how the developers behave when they use Dependabot, and we discover that on average, they only take 40 days instead of 180 days to remediate the vulnerable dependencies. This is a great improvement with respect to the industry's average. Well, we've spoken about securing the dependencies. Now, how can we secure the code you write? The shift left in security requires a native and automated approach that gives a priority to the developer. And this gives us the option with GitHub scans. You can make decisions with many different security tools and see them directly in a pull request as long as the configuration is applied. As an example, this is a pull request in GitHub for a demonstration application. And these are the changes proposed in the pull request. When is this pull request opened? They are executed automatically for a CI/CD to test the application. And one of these workflows generates the code looking for vulnerabilities and reports the results to GitHub. These results are shown in the pull request in the same way that the developers provide feedback through the code reviews. And since we're talking about securing code, it's worth mentioning code QL. QL means query language, and it's a semantic analyzer of the GitHub code. It's a technology that creates a relational database using your code as an entry or an input. They make consultations against that database to find security vulnerabilities in your code.
De que al buscar vulnerabilidades en el código a través de... lo siento.
When it searches for vulnerabilities in the code, as I was saying, what makes it special is that as it looks for vulnerabilities in the code through consultations or through inquiries, you can find many kinds of vulnerabilities, which is what we call the variant analysis. And it's a technique by means of which security researchers can find a vulnerability in the code, and by using these testing programs, and then use this finding so that they can establish a consultation to find other similar vulnerabilities in the code. So once you express a vulnerability as a consultation, as an inquiry, this can be used for other software projects too. So security researchers at Google and Microsoft share the consultations with the software development community. And when they do that, we analyze them and we make them available to the consumers if they are of a high quality. So going back again to our pull request, this is something that comes from code QL. And by clicking here on Show Paths, you can see that you can follow the data flow within that application. And well, you can see that a certain entry of the user is used here. And in a later stage, well, it's used over here, sorry. So it's used in a later stage, So that means that, well, we have an SQL injection attack. Another important issue of software protection is the protection of your secrets. So if your AWS credentials are introduced accidentally in your code, and that happens, dear friends, quite a lot, we will let you know immediately so that you can take a remediative action. Perhaps you can disable it completely. But what you can see on this slide, this is accessible and it guarantees the security of your repository. Here we have an example. Well, these are the outcomes of the sequence scanning, and by selecting this filtration sequence, you can decide what you want to do. You can either classify it as revoked or used in tests, etc. And you can decide what it is you want to do, or you can decide what kind of reaction you want to generate when you come across this finding. For public servers, this is especially critical, because once this has been filtered, these secrets will be exploited in a matter of seconds. And to avoid this, we are working with several providers of these services, and we tell them automatically when we believe that there's a secret in danger. If it's a valid secret, the provider could invalidate it and will get in touch with you automatically so that you can solve the problem. And the public repositories do not have this kind of vision of secrets because they are managed directly by the service provider. And a rapid reaction here is a very important thing. But if you feel curiosity about this, this is a list of providers of services that are working with us that will help you protect your secrets. And I'm sure that you will be able to recognize many of these logos, and the list is increasing over the months. So let's go back to the difficult question. No matter to what extent we believe that these technologies are surprising, do they work in practice? Well, let's say that as regards the industry and solving vulnerabilities in codes, that is 15% of the vulnerabilities found are fixed in 1 week. 45% of the vulnerabilities are solved in 90 days. And what does this mean? Well, it means that 55% or more than half of all of the vulnerabilities that are known in the case of software will only be fixed. And if they do so, it's 3 months after being discovered. And we have to do something better than that because the code vulnerabilities sometimes are exploited in a matter of hours or days, and 3 months is a very long time. And for the teams that are using code QL, the rate of correction reaches 72% during a pull request. And what that means is that 72% of the vulnerabilities, nearly 3/4 of these vulnerabilities are fixed in a matter of hours or a couple of days. And I hope that you agree that this is a very significant improvement. But now talking about securing your code, and I've already explained the tools that we provide and how they can be interacted or incorporated to the lifecycle of the software development, because this addresses all the vulnerabilities in your code directly at the level of the pull request, so they don't reach your production code. In other words, by performing the shift security lift, we maintain your code safe whilst we guarantee security. But if you use GitHub Actions for your workflows, what you have to do is scan your code with code QL, and it's as easy as adding on a file that contains workflow with the spaces necessary to carry out the scanning, which you can see on the right-hand side, for instance. And this is an example of one of the files for a Python project with code QL. So firstly, what you do is select the events and you generate the workload. And in our case, this is added onto the master branch. And then we have the pull requests that are created here that will be added onto this workflow. And apart from that, the code is scanned automatically once a day. And this is an important thing because even if it doesn't change, you can add on a new consultation or a new inquiry that would discover a vulnerability that is present in your code. But now, what you do is select an operating system which is where we will perform the code scan. And here we have the most recent version that is supported by GitHub. And then we perform another code checkout, and we use this action that is carried out to check out the code. And then after that, we initialize code QL. And finally, we scan the code and we send the results and to GitHub. And it's very easy because to create this file and to create this repository, we have a secure migration, which you can see here. Well, here we have a project, and this is a personal repository. And there are lots of tools for which we provide workflows and templates. And for instance, if we want to add on code QL, you can click on this button here and change. You can change things in this workflow on this file according to your needs. And then you can add on this repository file, and you can see that here, well, this is very similar to what we saw previously. So we only have to change it a little bit.
Ok, pero todavía eso no es DevSecOps. Y acá sí lo tenemos.
But we nearly have it. We nearly have DevSecOps, but we have to see how we can create a platform to govern security. And well, the important questions are, how can we make sure that security is taken into account during the development process? And how can we fulfill our security policies? How can we comply with them? How can we visually see the level of maturity of an organization in terms of how they manage security? Well, to make this become a necessary component for the development of software, you can provide branch protection. And this require that you get an approval for your workflows so that it's possible to merge your request. And for instance, and here we have an example of what this looks like. We are in a GitHub repository in the configuration of this repository. And here we have a couple of data protection rules. And let's look at the master branch. And here you can see that there's a status checking rule that has to be approved before the merge request is possible. In other words, require status checks to pass before merging. And this is where you could, for instance, introduce a required rule. It would be code QL. We could add on this task to guarantee the security of the code in the queue request, And then the final functionality that I would like to show you is called Security Overview. So all the things that I've shown right now are available free of charge for open source codes. And this is the only thing that is available to the enterprise customers that have activated this level of security. So the people responsible for security at any organization, they need to have access to some kind of visualization interface where they can determine what is happening. And the typical questions are the developers using their scanning tools that we provide them with, for instance? Or in which repository have these tools been enabled? Are there known vulnerabilities in the repositories of the organization? And which are the levels of risk? Or do we have any ciphered secrets? And this provides you with all of this information, and it's very easy to use or very easy to interpret. And here, for instance, we have the security overview of the Octo demo organization. And in the upper part, we have a summary. We have a summary of the risk information on the organization. And if we take a look over here, you can see what kinds of problems are present in our repositories. And in the lower section, you can see the information divided by repositories, and you can order the list according to different risk criteria. For instance, high or medium, and the number of vulnerabilities. For instance, you can organize things by the results of code scanning or by drop-out alerts, and so on and so forth. And this is the general vision that allows you to intervene on the most critical problems and see if the attitude of your organization in terms of security is improving over time. So, in a nutshell then, well, GitHub offers you solutions to guarantee the entire software lifecycle. And everything is integrated in the workflow of the developer. And thanks to this security overview, all of these options are available free of charge for open source repositories. So if you want to use them, well, you can start now at this very moment. And Well, that's all from me today, and I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation. And if you have any questions, I will be delighted to ask now. And if you want to get in touch with me, well, you have my address down below. You have my email address, and thanks a lot.
Muchísimas gracias.
Well, thanks a lot, Diego.
Presentación muy buena.
And that was a very fast and very good presentation. And you've shared your knowledge
Desarrollo de software.
and your
Y buenísima la
software
presentación. Digo, a final de
know-how. And well,
cuentas, en GitHub tenemos
at the end of the day, you can see that with GitHub, we have everything covered. We have high levels of security, and this has aggregated lots of value too, which is one of the issues that we should all take into account in order to avoid large costs, large production costs, not because of a vulnerability that affects our security, but rather what can cause that vulnerability. So thank you very much. And I think that we have some questions over there or somewhere,
Sí,
if I'm
tenemos
not mistaken.
una pregunta que
Yes, we will have one question that comes from the audience. And well, you've been talking a lot about the issue of security and about these capabilities
dar información pues, a los equipos.
of delivering information to the security teams. So the question is, if it's possible, perhaps in the future, perhaps you have plans, or perhaps this exists and right now in the current version of the security review, could you have a historic review of how a project has evolved? And could you map it or could you match it with the versions of the code so that you can say, well, look, so that you can identify things and to see where the vulnerabilities are? And do you think that that could happen in the future? And in other words, that there'd be, I think you said a loop back. Well, yes, that's a good question. As regards the pull request of the history of how you react to vulnerabilities is present. So therefore, you can see if a vulnerability has been solved or has been fixed. But for this case, for security overview at large, there's no history available, at least now. Well, this is a new functionality, so we still don't know what the future is going to look like, and there are lots of ideas, and this is a very good idea, by the way, and many thanks for mentioning it. But it's already possible to obtain that information and to create a history of how the vulnerabilities are solved by using our API. With our API, you can obtain that information and you can try to process it and create a story. But it's something that you have to do. There's no functionality at GitHub that provides you with this general overview, with this historic overview. But it is possible, however, that we might implement it, although this is an open issue for us. As I said, it's something new, and we'll see many new things happening too in the field of security over the next months. Okay, very good. Fine. Okay, we have another question. I think that it's the last question because I'm afraid that we're coming to the end of the seminar. And there are lots of organizations that use PUVs as a way of mapping artifacts and versions, and also to obtain security. So what you've mentioned, how does it relate to this way of working? Is there compatibility? Is there not compatibility? Or could you perhaps give us the point of view of GitHub? I didn't understand what you said at the beginning, please. Well, there are companies that use an analysis of vulnerabilities that are associated with specific versions of open source products. And what they do is a mapping of this CVE, and then they also use filters. But how is this related to the utilization of these tools, which have artifacts and versions of artifacts and are mapped as a database of vulnerabilities that is public? With these tools that GitHub is now presenting to us now to improve security? Well, if I understood your question correctly, well, something that we try to solve for you, because these tools are tools that automatically obtain that information so that you do not have to use other tools. Everything is integrated in the GitHub development cycle. So it's possible to use other tools. Yes, of course, why not? And pull request, for instance, you can add on other code scanning systems and then present the data. But if you want to do everything with an integrated tool that is native, or you can do that with Tenabot, I think you said, and that's where you can get a history. Because, for instance, for auditing, I don't know how you say that in Spanish. Anyway, for audits, auditoría in Spanish, thank you very much. Well, for auditing, it's a very important thing. And that is that you'll be able to construct a history of the development process that also phrases a question where you can see how the development team reacted to the information. And this is something that can be found in the pull request. And for companies, there's another utility that's called Oriblocks, I think he said, that where we have a history too of activities in the organization that also deal with the security issue, which is something that is very important for audits. Okay, well, thank you very much, Diego. Perfect. Okay. Well, once again, many thanks and congratulations for this presentation you've given us. That was extremely interesting. And well, thank you all very much indeed for having connected. And I suppose that what's coming along now is the closure of the day. So many thanks to everybody, and we'll continue here and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Bye-bye.